At 40, money feels calm, not confusing. At 20, he chose to understand it. At 40, every decision has clarity. At 20, he asked the right questions. At 40, wealth feels structured. At 20, he built simple habits. At 40, numbers make sense. At 20, he stopped ignoring them. At 40, money works quietly for him. At 20, he started small. At 40, he doesn't chase money. At 20, he learned how it moves. At 40, stress around money is rare. At 20, discipline became normal. At 40, his finances feel intentional. At 20, he lived with purpose. At 40, every rupee has direction. At 20, he gave it one. At 40, growth feels predictable. At 20, he chose consistency. At 40, he trusts his decisions. At 20, he learned from mistakes. At 40, money is a tool, not a problem. At 20, he saw it that way. At 40, he understands risk. At 20, he studied it. At 40, he moves with patience. At 20, he stopped rushing. At 40, wealth feels stable. At 20, he built a foundation. At 40, he sees opportunities clearly. At 20, he trained his mind. At 40, his life has financial order. At 20, he created structure. At 40, he invests with confidence. At 20, he learned the basics. At 40, money grows quietly. At 20, he planted the seeds. At 40, he avoids unnecessary risks. At 20, he understood consequences. At 40, he controls his spending. At 20, he controlled his impulses. At 40, he sees long-term clearly. At 20, he chose patience over pleasure. At 40, financial freedom feels close. At 20, he started early. At 40, he understands value. At 20, he learned the difference between want and need. At 40, money decisions feel simple. At 20, he made them a habit.
At 40, he doesn't follow the crowd. At 20, he questioned it. At 40, he builds wealth quietly. At 20, he avoided showing off. At 40, his income has purpose. At 20, he defined it. At 40, he sees money as a system. At 20, he started building it. At 40, he avoids financial noise. At 20, he focused on fundamentals. At 40, he knows when to act. At 20, he learned when to wait. At 40, his life feels balanced. At 20, he chose discipline. At 40, money feels predictable. At 20, he built consistency. At 40, he avoids emotional decisions. At 20, he understood his behavior. At 40, he respects money. At 20, he learned its value. At 40, his future feels secure. At 20, he planned for it. At 40, he makes money work. At 20, he stopped working blindly. At 40, he thinks in decades. At 20, he stopped thinking in days. At 40, he chooses wisely. At 20, he learned how to choose. At 40, he builds without pressure. At 20, he removed distractions. At 40, money flows with direction. At 20, he gave it discipline. At 40, he understands opportunity cost. At 20, he learned to say no. At 40, he values time over money. At 20, he realized it early. At 40, he moves with awareness. At 20, he paid attention. At 40, he builds with intention. At 20, he avoided randomness. At 40, money feels like a system he controls. At 20, he built that system slowly. At 40, he lives with financial clarity. At 20, he removed confusion. At 40, he trusts the process. At 20, he committed to it. At 40, wealth feels earned, not lucky. At 20, he chose the long path.